What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 143, and I'm the co-host of the show, Kyle Anslone, joined by the other co-host, Will Porter. Will, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you doing tonight?
Doing great, Will. I think we got a great show today. I was starting to go to work, making some notes, and my list would end up real long. So I think we're gonna have a lot of important stuff to talk about today, especially what's going on in the West Bank in the past week. So
Yes,
I
yeah.
think this is gonna be a great show. Will people could find the show at the Libertarian Institute. That's where we host it. Libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. We post a video version on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. Please subscribe to the show at one of those places. We, use maps. We got the articles in the show, the video version. So I think it does enhance the value a little bit. But if you just like the audio version, it's up anywhere you could listen to podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. So you need a full dose of foreign policy news and get this show and the Scott Horton show in the same feed. That's where you can find that. We also got the show on our Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter accounts. And then you could donate to the show, help us out at Patreon and Subscribestar. Also linked to crypto in the show notes page. Links to everything I talked about are in the show notes page. Very easy to find to get your way around and support our work on all those content. And also to find our sponsor, Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com. Will they have a great selection of CBD products there? I know, some people in our audience are probably already CBD users. They know what, they like gummies for anxiety or they like topicals like I do for the back pain. But Will, what do you like? And, what is your favorite product over there at Paloma Verde?
Yeah, I mean, they got all kinds of stuff that you can check out. My favorite are the soft gels, definitely. They've got ones with curcumin, they've got different formulations, but for me, particularly, the melatonin soft gels are the best. They help with me, help me wind down, help me with insomnia. So those are all great. Also, the oil tinctures, too, are one of my favorites as well. Those just have the highest dose of CBD you can get. And so if that stuff sounds interesting to you, or if you want to check out their educational resources or their lab results, anything like that, check out palomaverdecbd.com and use the promo code PEACE to get 25% off your order over $75.
All right, well, let's get into the episode. And the first thing I want to talk about on today's show is the most recent report we got from the Inspector in General for Afghan Reconstruction. I think his name is John Sopko.
Yeah.
And for, well, I think actually over a decade now, God, I can't believe how long this war has been going on. Sopko has been
Yeah.
running this department where he puts out, I think, quarterly reports, occasionally testifies in front of Congress, and has given over time different metrics for what's happening in the Afghan war. Sometimes, for years we used to get reports here, Will, about how much territory the Taliban controlled versus the Afghan government or the U.S. Now that's no longer included, but there are still some really important facts and figures in this report. And then Sopko himself, I think, gave some pretty important and interesting testimony. So, Will, what
Yeah.
are the highlights of this?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned Sopko. He is, he's been pretty consistently one of the only officials that are really critical or remotely good on the Afghan war. And I think this new quarterly report that came out last week kind of keeps with that trend. It does not paint that good of a picture. It really also doesn't tell us much that we didn't know already, sort of in broad strokes. But there are some like specific stats and figures in there that we can get into. And like I said, it does not look very good. After 20 years of fighting, trillions of dollars that we've blown trying to prop up the government and the military over there, thousands of people killed on all sides, and it seems like we pretty much have nothing to show for it. And this report kind of highlights some of that. Especially as it's issued just as the Pentagon is saying. I think the last they said was that they're more than 90% out of the country. So the withdrawals is apparently going forward, according to them. But you had mentioned that they sort of stopped giving really specific breakdowns of like what territory the Taliban controls versus the government. This report does include some of that information partially. And basically, right now, the Taliban is grabbing up a whole lot of territory. They've kind of parlayed their usual spring offensive. Usually, when the spring comes around, they call that fighting season, and that's when sort of it picks up again. But they've kind of parlayed that spring offensive into a larger summer offensive, it seems. Because just between June and July, they went from controlling 81 districts in Afghanistan to more than 200. That's about half of the country. I think there are 419 districts in Afghanistan. They are leaving the provincial capitals alone. They're basically taking over the countryside. I think that they don't control. I don't know if they control any of the provincial capitals right now. Certainly not Kabul. This is not.
Well, they did
Oh, go ahead.
attack the capital of Helmand, Lashkargah, last week. I'm not sure what the status of that offensive is now, but apparently they were like in the outer districts of that. And when I talked to Danny last week, he explained that Kandahar, I think he said, is a very large city, and they were in the outer districts of that city too. But for people who have maybe lived in one of America's real big cities, like around Chicago or something like that, you could be in Wisconsin and kind of be in a suburb of Chicago. So they could be pretty far away from the city, but in some sense, I guess they are, especially in the very heavily Pashtun areas, at least starting to toy with the idea of these capitals.
Right, right. And I mean, it's like not too uncommon for them to kind of leave the major cities alone. Sometimes they will go in there and take it for a couple days. A lot of time it's sort of a gesture just to show like, look what we can do. But that is interesting. Like the report had said that they don't currently hold any of those, but like the things you're talking about are very recent. So perhaps they are now starting to push into some of those provincial capitals. However, earlier on in the spring, when they sort of started launching this offensive between March and May, there were more than 10,000 Taliban attacks, which is sort of an uptick compared to the same period in the previous years. I think last year it had 1,000 attacks fewer than the same period of the spring in 2021. And they've mostly been, almost exclusively been focusing these attacks on local Afghan forces. At least the report says. I think they've not really hit on U.S. or coalition troops too much since the deal was signed with Trump in 2020. So apparently, there is a spike in attacks, though it's almost exclusively being directed against local forces. And over the summer, these attacks have sort of picked up in intensity and violence to the point that the period between May and June is a sort of a record number of civilian casualties. Like just over those couple months, I think 800 civilians were killed and 1,600 injured. And the UN is saying that this could make 2021 overall one of the deadliest years since they started counting this stuff in 2009. I think there had been some more violent years prior to that, but since they at least started keeping track of this, they're saying 2021 could be one of the more deadly years. So there's definitely been a spike in violence and deaths with all these recent attacks. And it does seem the Afghan military and sort of security forces can't stop it. The report even kind of describes them as being surprised and caught off guard by some of these attacks, which is a little strange given that sort of everyone's been predicting a Taliban offensive once the U.S. starts packing up and leaving. And it did sort of coincide with the spring offensive as well. So it's a little odd that they're so taken off guard by this.
And hasn't the Afghan government itself warned about like a Taliban takeover if the U.S. should leave? So, I mean, it seems like that's just has to be a poor excuse coming out of the Afghan government. There's no possible way they didn't see this coming.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a bit odd that they would be like so surprised by this. This is something that not only we've been warning about, but they've been, or at least talking about this possibility for a long time. But let's see. Poppy cultivation. There's a bit on this in the new SIGAR report. It's on a major rise in Afghanistan. People might recall Trump had that big drug war mission out there while he was in office, Operation Iron Tempest, where U.S. warplanes were bombing heroin labs and other kind of like drug production sites. And that ended up killing a lot of civilians. I think we covered that on the show a little bit, but it apparently had no lasting effect whatsoever because in 2020, poppy cultivation was up 37% compared to the previous year. And the highest concentrations of that were in Helmand and Kandahar provinces, which are both like heavily, controlled by the Taliban. And the Taliban itself doesn't always, they're not the ones actually growing the poppies or harvesting the opium or producing the heroin, but these things can be sort of taxed at various stages of production when they're done in their areas. And so this ends up being very lucrative for them, ends up helping to sort of bankroll their operations, which I know we've covered that in a big long write-up back in 2018. But I think basically right now we may be seeing the fruits of last year's like larger poppy crop that is sort of bankrolling this big offensive. But in terms of sort of like the security situation that's mentioned in the report, that's about all I had. As pretty much anyone could have predicted, as we've been saying all along, the U.S. withdrawal will not necessarily be a nice walk in the park. I think it's sort of inevitable there's going to be violence as things kind of shift back to a more natural balance of power, as opposed to right now the U.S. is kind of propping up this like, house of cards, this like power bubble that can't really exist in its current form on its own. So, this report I think kind of illustrates all that. And you had mentioned this earlier. The guy who behind these reports, John Sopko, he was even more harsh and critical about all this when he was briefing the media about this last week. There was one line, and I'll read the quote, but there's one line where he's basically just saying that like the U.S. is pretty much guaranteed to repeat these failures of the Afghan war. He said, quote, don't believe what you're told by the generals or the ambassadors or people in the administration saying we're never going to do this again. That's exactly what we said after Vietnam. We're never going to do this again. Lo and behold, we did Iraq and we did Afghanistan. We will do this again, end quote. And I'm not sure if I could have summed it up much better than that. Like even as we finally seem to be headed out of this war, and even that part isn't totally certain given all this talk about over the horizon capabilities and stationing troops in neighboring countries and all this stuff. But even assuming we're definitely leaving, if nobody's learned any of these lessons here, we are doomed to repeat this stuff over again. Like even if the average American in flyover country, even if they're fed up with this and they understand that this was a disaster, it does not look like these lessons have sunk in for the government or for the foreign policy establishment or the media, and they are the ones often who get us into these things. It's not the average person. So unfortunately, I think Sopko might be right about this assessment that we are sort of doomed to repeat these things.
Right. And I feel like the scary part is right now, Will, is we may be doomed to repeat it in Afghanistan. As long as there are 650 troops at our embassy in Kabul, I mean, that essentially turns it into a military base. And when you have something that's essentially a military base, Danny Sturgeon's on a great podcast recently. I forget what it's called, but he basically explains that one of the ways the U.S. mission creeped worked in Vietnam is they started to deploy troops to like some diplomatic mission, but then those troops start having to go on little maneuvers outside the base to, deter rocket fire. Well, then they started getting attacked on those missions, and so they had to control a little bit more territory to make sure they weren't attacked. And it seems very possible that something like this happens in Afghanistan, especially after we have seen a change somewhat in the U.S. mission, not mission, I guess, in Afghanistan, but the way we're conducting our operations there in the past week or so, with a vast uptick in airstrikes and directly targeting the Taliban, which I isn't this a violation of the Doha Accords, Will? Didn't that say that the U.S. wasn't going to directly attack the Taliban? Now, I know the U.S. has done this throughout the whole time, since the Doha Accords have been signed. We've attacked the Taliban several times, even after Trump, and they seem to tolerate to some extent. Still, there hasn't been an attack on a U.S. soldier fatality in the country, but how long will they tolerate that for before they start taking shots at the U.S., diplomats or soldiers there in that country? And then how does the U.S. react from there? I guess it seems a real question going forward. Will, do you have anything else on Afghanistan?
No, that was basically the highlights, I think, out of that new SIGAR report. There was other stuff in there about like the financial audits that people might find interesting, but I paid more attention to the more security situation in my write-up about it.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks for that breakdown. Should we move on and talk about Haiti?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you had a couple short updates there, something about they're headed for new elections possibly. But yeah, please tell us. Start wherever you want, but please tell us about that.
Yeah, I kind of want to get into and break down some of the dynamics here, especially and remind people that last week on the show, you had brought us an update about the new prime minister of Haiti, who became prime minister suddenly after having Western support. The U.S. was backing, I believe, what is it, Claude Joseph,
Yes.
and then who was the prime minister prior to the presidential assassination. However, at the time, the president had nominated somebody else or appointed somebody else to become prime minister. They just hadn't done like the state ritual part of that whole thing to phase out the old guy and bring in the new guy. And so the U.S. actually switched their position and decided to back who was the person that Mosi did nominate before he was killed, Ariel Henry. And Henry, wants to hold elections right away. And I find one thing that's really interesting about that, Will, is that, Henry wants what apparently the West wants. Daniel Larison has this breakdown saying that the Washington Post and the Western influence are very concerned about making sure an election is held hopefully in the fall in Haiti. Now, one of the reasons they want that is because they say that will require foreign intervention. And so this is now what the prime minister is saying, the guy who was, assumed power after he was backed by the West. And it just happens to coincide with the Western policy, and a policy that, the war hawks at the Washington Post will believe helped lead to a mission creep U.S. military intervention on the ground in Haiti. And Larson has a great breakdown saying that, look, the U.S. always says anytime there's instability, what we need to do is elections. Elections are going to fix things. I don't know if anybody's lived in the U.S. for the past couple of decades, but it seems that things get a little bit more chaotic and divided around election time. Not exactly, those aren't exactly coming together moments for seemingly any nation, but particularly one which has had, so much foreign intervention and violent overthrow. I mean, the president was just assassinated in his bed. That's, that signals that, there's a lot of instability in that country. And so with this, Will, the groups are saying, and Larson is saying, that there may be a need for the country to slow down and try to take account, at least first, of what's broken before you start to nominate a person to fix the country. There's still no, and I'll get into some updates here in a second, but there's still no conclusive answer as to who was behind the assassination of the former president, which may be something that the people would want to know about before they decide to go to the ballot box and vote again. You don't want to vote for another president who's just going to get assassinated. You certainly don't want to vote for anybody who either profited off of the assassination or was somehow involved in it. And so these, seem to be important answers. And Will, as somebody who's looking at this, saying, the Haitian police are accusing an American firm of potentially, hiring the Colombians, and maybe the U.S. is pushing to have this election happen before it comes out who all was behind this in the final reports and stuff. I don't know. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening. Well, a lot of questions to be asked. But Larson points out there's civil society groups within Haiti who are pushing back against the election and pushing back against the foreign intervention narrative. And it's just so interesting. Well, in the U.S., of course, if you had a bunch of white people trying to speak for what a community of color needed, they be labeled as racist. But here you have it in an imperial sense, where they just dictate to this country, you guys need elections in the coming months. That's what we want. And if you guys can't get that done on your own, we're going to force you to take the steps that you need to take with our soldiers to have that happen. And then just one more concerning thing, Will, about this, and there's not a lot of clarification on what the new prime minister Henry meant when he said this, but he said that he will work to eliminate all irritants that could get in the way of a new election. And so I'm not, that sounds awfully severe. I'm not sure. Maybe there's some kind of translation issue I'm not catching here, or some kind of Haitian phrase that, just basically means we're going to, tinker around the edges and do what we need to do. But it sounds a lot more to me, Will, like he's saying that he's going to round up anybody who maybe is competition or something like that, or certainly anybody he can. I guess anything on this before we move into the assassination part of the update?
Yeah, I might kind of steal your thunder here a little bit. I don't have any details on this, but I just wanted to sort of piggyback on what you said about just like, taking some time to figure out and unravel this plot. Because I think just recently the Haitian authorities are saying that some judge or something may have been involved in the assassination plot. And so if people in the government and high level officials were potentially involved, well, yeah, don't you want to kind of figure out who may have been part of that before you start electing people and putting in people in positions of authority and all that kind of stuff? So I thought that was a good point.
Right. And let's continue on that and talk about that judge, who is a former Supreme Court judge in Haiti who was dismissed sometime recently. I didn't actually find the date. And the dismissal was apparently over dispute with Mosi. And she was, this woman's name is Wendell Conthiot. I'm probably mispronouncing. It's probably French, so I have no idea how to look at it. But Wendell here was serving justice on the bench and was dismissed, being alleged to have been in a previous coup plot or some kind of power grab against Mosi. Now, in fairness, maybe, as a member of the Supreme Court, will she saw herself as like, hey, the president's grabbing all kind of power as a checks and balances kind of system. We're supposed to check the president, and maybe that is being portrayed as a coup. I have no idea of how this works or how accurate the charges against her are. But this is so there's obviously some probably tensions here between her and the eventually assassinated president, though, right? Because he seems to have at the very least pinned something on her to remove her from her position, if not she was actually responsible for the plot that he alleges. Now the police say that the suspected assassins visited her home twice. I didn't get a clarity on how many assassins, if all the assassins met there together, what her home is. Maybe there's a reason, like people entering a foreign country come to. I have no idea why if or why these people would be here. However, all this put together, does seem like fair to say this is a person of interest and somebody to definitely keep an eye on going forward. Although I'm not quite sure this necessarily allies with some of the other speculation that Mosi was possibly executed by the gangs. Now, to talk about the actual assassination itself, we are getting some reports coming from the Colombian soldiers. I think there's 18 of them that are being held alleged, to be involved in the plot. This from the Wall Street Journal. They're saying that they were fooled, and this seems like a very convenient story to me, Will. But we'll I'll go through, break it down, and we could talk about it after as to what the possible motives are here. But
yeah,
one thing that's important to note is apparently these, I believe 18 men from Colombia. They are apparently former special forces of Colombia. And so that to me made me think that they may have made a little bit more substantial training from the U.S. If it's just a Colombian soldier, well, I find it possible that, they went to some gun cleaning class that was taught by the Pentagon, some kind of mate, you know what I mean? But their special forces, maybe they were even in bed trained with U.S. special forces. So, it's possible that these were deeply involved in the Pentagon and U.S. Special Forces community, something to look at here. But apparently they're all being held in a room that's not very big. I'm guessing the conditions aren't very good. However, as this article points out, it's maybe not a great thing to hold all of your, accused coup plotters in the same room together, because then they could formulate a story. And they, I guess, have formulated a story. Well, I shouldn't say it because it could be true. But what they are putting forward is that they were duped. They say that they were told that, I guess it was the American Haitians or Haitian Americans were DEA agents, and they were hired by those DEA agents to go and raid the home and arrest the president. And they made it sound like there was paperwork and stuff official. So, and I believe these statements are mostly coming through the defense team, which I want to note, it was hooked up by lawyers from the Organization of American States, which I would assume is taking the line in the position of the U.S. and the Colombian government, with the U.S. being a major contributor and influencer of the OAS, and then the Colombian government being a main and key U.S. Political ally in South America. So, Will, anything on here before I keep going with some more details?
Yeah, I just wanted to say this kind of reminds me because we had previously gotten some, at least it was testimony relayed through, I think, a judge or a prosecutor in Haiti, but testimony from those two Haitian Americans. And they had also said that they had been duped in some way. They had claimed that like they thought there was some kind of like court order to go arrest the president. They thought they were going to just bring him back to the presidential palace and all this stuff. And that's, I don't know what to make any of this. The involvement of the former judge is also very intriguing because like I wonder if somehow she had, or he, I forget if it was a he or she.
It's a she.
She had contacts with some current judges or something, and they did like create some paperwork. Like I don't know. I wonder if like some of the story is actually true and they were actually duped, or how much of it is just sort of cover and just like just their story to get out of it. I have no idea.
Right, and I'm not exactly sure because there's allegations that one of the members of the presidential guard was involved as well, and I'm
Right.
not
Yeah.
quite sure how that plays in with this, the narrative that's being kind of put forward here.
Right.
The other, I guess, a couple other things to note is there's some concern over the conditions that they're being held in. I mean, it's kind of what you would maybe expect. It doesn't seem like it's horrific, but also nobody would ever want to live there. Nobody's comfortable. Some of
Right.
the people have minor injuries apparently from the arrest. I'm not sure if, maybe that came after they were in handcuffs or before,
Right.
but they say some minor injuries. There are also some reports that some of those detained say they signed documents in French and they don't speak French. And
Oh,
so
geez.
it's possible, if we get a statement from the government saying that from this signed statement, the defendants agree to this, this is a reason to be skeptical of that. I think that's about all I have here, Will. This does raise a couple questions that I just wanted to bring up. One
Yeah.
is that have these Colombians worked with the DEA before. It seems all, I don't know. I wouldn't believe it if some guy just showed up and said, "I was in the DEA. We're gonna go arrest this guy." No matter how official his paperwork looked, no matter how many badges he had, it would have to be some official walk into DEA headquarters stuff before I think you would maybe buy that. So it seems
Yeah.
like such a stretch that this could be true. Also, there's a huge problem here, Will, with all these guys staying together. Also, the FBI has interviewed each of these people a few times. So I believe that's all the details I have on that so far, other than the Haitian government alleging that the squad worked for the American company CTU, although that company has not put out an official statement yet. And then one last interesting thing to note is, I guess, when the Wall Street Journal asked the DEA to comment specifically about the allegations being made, they declined to comment, where in the past they did not denied the allegation. So I'm not sure what to make of all this, Will, but I want to continue to put forward all the details that we're having coming out because this is some place where we could see an American intervention, I think, in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we already have a Marine contingent, I think, at the embassy there, and yeah, it does sort of seem like that it's heading in that direction. But yeah, I definitely want to keep covering this and just sort of as these pieces keep coming out, it is an interesting story, the assassination.
Well, let's move on and stay in the region and talk about Cuba, where Biden, with the heavy hand of his sanctions coming down, looks more like Donald Trump than Barack Obama, and announced new sanctions on, I believe, a police force in Cuba. So, what's happening, and then what does this say about Biden's Cuba policy?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I know we definitely covered. I know the big round of protests in Cuba a couple weeks ago over just like some basic things, shortages of goods, the government's response to the pandemic, and all this. We also, I know, hit on some of like the bad media coverage that followed that. But at that point, I don't think the Biden administration had actually taken any action in relation to the protests. But that has now changed over these last couple weeks because we've had actually several layers of new sanctions now imposed on Cuba. The latest came last Friday that you just mentioned. The Treasury Department announced sanctions on what they call the Cuban National Revolutionary Police Force, and it's like two top officials, the director Oscar Callejas and his deputy Eddie Sierra. And I admittedly don't know a whole lot about these two guys, but they're being accused of helping to crack down on and sort of suppress these protests. And I think that includes like sort of going around afterward and rounding people up. And I'm not really sure to what extent that is happening, but there's definitely been reports of like arbitrary detentions and people being disappeared and all that kind of stuff. And I guess I don't really doubt that some of that is happening there. And these sanctions were announced just as Biden went to meet with Cuban like exile and diaspora groups. So that seemed kind of significant. It seemed strategic, sort of like just a PR stunt. It did seem like some of this was done for domestic consumption, because I don't think these sanctions on this police force will have much of an effect. They were largely symbolic. I mean, the entire island's already under an embargo. And so I'm not sure these additional sanctions on these two guys or the police force will do much to change the situation on the ground, certainly. However, in that meeting with those Cuban American groups, Biden also promised that more sanctions would be coming. He didn't give any detail or clarify what that would mean or where they would go, but he did suggest that there will be more penalties. And those would be added not only to those sanctions on the cops that we just talked about, but there's another round of sanctions too imposed the week before last on the defense minister, Alvaro Lopez Miera. I think they also hit a special forces unit there too called the SNB that both apparently were involved in repressing the protests. That's what is alleged by Washington. So there's been several layers of sanctions now on Cuba over these protests or the government's response to them. That's basically what I had there on that. Biden does seem like he's starting his own sort of little like maximum pressure campaign or some kind of pressure campaign on the Cubans. We have these 2 layers of sanctions and apparently more coming. It's not really clear what he expects to accomplish with these. As I said, this looks like it could be more about the optics than it really is about, changing anything in Cuba. Like if they really wanted to help the average Cuban, they could lift the blockade that they've kept on there for 60 years. That might actually do something to help people with goods or medicine or prices or whatever for the average person. There's one other thing too. The Biden administration has also been talking about how they want to improve internet access within Cuba somehow. I guess they have some ways they could do that with like private internet providers because the government there is apparently they're allegedly reportedly shutting things down and sort of messing with the internet. But this does seem like another area where they're going to be trying to intervene more, the U.S. administration. And the Cubans, I think, have a pretty good reason to be skeptical about this kind of thing, because people might recall that there was this social media project back in the 2010s called Zunzunio. It was marketed initially as just like the Cuban version of Twitter, but it later was revealed that the entire thing was a big covert operation to encourage Cubans to like protest and revolt and have their own. I think at the time it was described as have their own Cuban Spring, like the Arab Spring. The Associated Press actually had done the reporting on this, and they showed that this app was funded by USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and they had done this through a bunch of cutout companies to hide their involvement. But sort of the idea was that to start this out as a normal social media platform and slowly introduce more and more political content and political messaging to try to like radicalize Cubans. And this was all covered by the AP. And that project was shut down in 2012, but there was another one they launched in 2014 called Pyramidio that was a similar thing. It worked through text messaging, but it was the same kind of idea. It was funded through a U.S. government agency called the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, and they tried to send these like anti-communist, anti-Cuban propaganda through text messages to Cubans. So the U.S. government has been trying to manipulate politics in Cuba through the internet and through sort of mass communications for quite a while now, and it seems like Biden is taking another crack at that with all this stuff about expanding internet access.
Right. Well, I sometimes see maybe some libertarians who live in fantasy land, Ancapistan in your head, no, but this fantasy idea about the U.S. government that they would do something like just out of the kindness of their hearts and to help the Cuban people get better internet access, they would, launch some kind of project. And, well, there's some libertarians that would, I think, be like, that's a good thing. That's something the U.S. government should do. So what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, like, I can see where they're coming from, just the principle of I don't like communism. And so, like, I guess if we just do some things to help the people, but it never ends there. I mean, like, what happens when the Cubans do start revolting and the government starts, responding the way that governments typically respond to revolts with force? Like, what is the U.S. going to do then? Certainly, it's just a path to more and more and more intervention. And that's clearly what they want, too. It's not like this is sort of like unintended. I think that was sort of the idea with that whole Zunzunio thing, was to create just a crap storm in Cuba to facilitate more U.S. intervention to see, our regime change that we want, that we've been trying for a long time there.
Right. All right. Well, let's talk about Israel.
Yeah. I think you had a couple. I think there to go over in Israel and the occupied West Bank. There's been a couple like very egregious cases of the military. I think just straight up murdering people in cold blood. So what the hell is happening over there?
Yeah, so this is in the West Bank. This isn't even in Gaza. This is in the West Bank. Some of the a little bit more free of like the third class citizens of Israel. And there's been 4 killings in the past week, including a 12-year-old, and then somebody was killed at the 12-year-old's funeral. So I'm going to go through and break down these 4 killings, and then I want to get into this article in Haaretz by Gordian Levy that is absolutely fantastic, explaining just how cruel the Israel policy is for the Palestinians living in the West Bank right now and how little their lives mean. The first death is, I got some articles here from some various sources where I strung together all these details. The first death is Mohammed al-Amani, and he was killed in the village of Bet Amar. I believe he was the 7th person killed in that village this year, and he was also the 11th Palestinian child killed in the West Bank alone. That doesn't also include the bombing campaign in Gaza or any children that have been killed by Israeli forces, at the Gaza fence or within Israel proper. This is
Jerusalem, yeah.
or East Jerusalem. This is just talking about Israeli forces killing kids in the West Bank in 2021. So that's absolutely crazy. What happens in this story, from what I could tell, stringing it all together, Will, is in the morning, I believe Friday, there was a funeral in a cemetery where a young newborn girl was buried. Now, Israel has portrayed this as there was a young female that was discarded, right? Like, they make it sound like it wasn't a funeral. The Palestinian side say it was a funeral. The Israeli forces then say they saw a car that they believe was a car involved in discarding of the corpse. Again, that was a Palestinian that was at the funeral. No, it's not clear. It doesn't seem like that baby was a member of this family, so I'm not exactly sure. Anyways, the family's on their way home. They say the dad who's driving says, they made a change. They were going to go home, but then the kids wanted to go to the convenience store, so he made a turn, decided to go to the convenience store. According to the Israelis, what happened there is they saw the car they believed was involved. They fired some warning shots. The car pulled away, and so then they claim they fired 13 shots to try to shoot out the tire of the car. However, of the father and I believe 4 children in the car, one, the 12-year-old Mohammed, was shot 5 times in the chest and then eventually died and succumbed to his injuries. So I don't know. There's a lot of details here, especially from the Israeli telling of this story, Will, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think my perspective, it sounds a hell of a lot like there was a funeral, they desecrated the grave, and then in their hysteria, they saw a car that vaguely resembled a car that was involved, and it opened fire on a car full of children. There's not even a remote allegation that this car was like going to ram or any, usually they'll say, and the Palestinians will say the car wasn't moving, but they'll say the car was going to ram us. It seems like even the Israeli version of this story says that the car wasn't a threat to them. And so it sounds like the Israeli forces elected to spray this car with bullets. Now, the problem I have with saying that they shot out the tires, it seems like almost an execution, like somebody had to be aiming at this kid. If you had at least 3 other people in the car and you only hit one, that sounds like aiming to me. I don't exactly know, but Mohammed unfortunately dies, and then the next day they're holding his funeral in his village, and
desecrating his body. You mean, according to the Israelis?
Right. But during this funeral, unclear how it happens, they say clashes break out. Look, no matter how you look at this, it's the Israeli soldiers' fault. If you're involved, yes. If you're responsible for killing somebody, you don't. If the Minneapolis Police Department showed up to the funeral of George Floyd and yes, people started throwing rocks at the police officers, and then the police officers opened fire, that would be a massacre. That plain and simple, and that's what happened. Well, actually, I didn't even read that he was throwing stones. I assume that, I would imagine having been a 20-year-old man once myself, if the people showed up to a funeral of somebody I cared about who murdered him, I would probably do something. I would probably be acting in a way that could be portrayed as violent. Like,
Yeah.
That's just how you act. That's because people are essentially desecrating your culture and your life and treating you like worse than, as Gordon Levy puts it, people would care. The media would care more if this happened to dogs than versus how it happens to Palestinians. And
Yeah.
so this young man's name was Sakar Awad, and I'm sorry for all these people for mispronouncing your names. I don't speak Arabic. I'm trying my best, but he was shot in the head and gut. And that's really all I have on his story. That's all the details that have emerged so far. I try not to just, repeat unverified eyewitness reports. The people at the or at the funeral, excuse me, say that they had tear gas and live rounds fired at them. It's unclear if this kid was targeted or if they were just maybe spraying into the crowd. But either way, it's absolutely tragic. The next death is in the city of I guess Bita. It's 1 year old. Now, if you read the U.S. mainstream, like kind of reporting, everybody describes him as a plumber. However, in the more Arab sources, Al Jazeera, Middle East side, they describe him either as a water engineer or a water technician. And
Yeah.
so my guess is that this guy wasn't going to somebody's house to fit somebody's sink. He was probably like involved in the irrigation systems, like sewage and stuff like, something maybe
Right.
a little bit more
Civil engineering.
substantial to the community than just a plumber. But anyways, in this situation, they say that this is the story from the Israeli forces' point of view. I want to make that clear. This is what they say happened. That Shahid Salim was, I guess, walking towards them, and they told him to stop. They fired a warning shot, and because he had what they described as an iron bar in his hand, they decided to kill him. They didn't try, like, he just had an iron bar. It's unclear exactly of how close he was to the Israeli forces at the time, but this seems like nowhere near where you could justify using lethal force and just killing a man. And it's not even clear, that he was trying to attack the Israeli soldiers at all. There's a lot of questions to how this death happened and everything like that, but it is rather concerning. And then at a protest so he was killed on July 27th, and then I believe on July 29th it was in his village, the Israeli forces came, used tear gas and live fire, and injured 21 other people. And so
Wow.
I mean, this is horrible, and it's like I don't even like talking about this to a point, Will, but it's just it has to be discussed. Now, the last one I have here is a 17-year-old man, Mohammed Taimi. He is related and a relative of the Taimi family, and this
Oh,
was in
really?
the village of Nabi Salah,
Wow.
and all as I was able to like dig up on this one so far is that he was killed. The Palestinians say that he was shot in the back. As always, they say there were rounds fired, that there were clashes. Again, if these are clashes, they're people throwing rods versus somebody with the U.S. military being the occupation force is what described as clashes. But that's how it's described in the media. And but the Palestinians say that he was shot in the back, this young man. And so while I don't have a ton of details on all of these cases, in none of them do the Israeli forces at all even remotely allege that it was our life or his, right? It's not
Right.
even close. It was this I told this person to do something and they didn't listen, so I killed them. It's not even clear that they heard you or weren't responding to you, were fleeing from you, were a threat to anyone. But right now, it seems like the status in the West Bank is that even if you are a child, simply not following the orders of the Israeli forces puts you subject to being killed. This is full on martial law, in like the most cruel and unbelievable way. What they're living through in the West Bank. So, well, those are the four cases, and I could get into the Goran Levy article, but I'm not sure if you have anything.
Yeah, I just wanted, like, I think people should just realize that, like, the level of state violence that the average Palestinian lives under in the West Bank, especially, where, like you said, like, I think it even goes beyond martial law. It's like occupation law. Like, martial law is like when your own government is ruling you with the military. Occupation is when someone else, a foreign force, is now ruling you. And so that's sort of the situation in the West Bank, where the like deadly force can be wielded so arbitrarily, and the amount of violence that's used just against any kind of gathering, like you're like, even a funeral, they can't even gather to mourn the loss of their loved ones who were killed at the hands of Israeli soldiers. They can't even do that. Any gathering is treated as like a hostile activity, and they treat it, they respond accordingly, and that just happens. I mean, these four stories you just listed, like, they're horrible and egregious, but there are so many thousands more just like that, exactly like that are completely arbitrary, no conceivable justification, but it just continues on.
If I had clicked back another month in my news roundup archive, Will, I could have pulled up, I guess, at least four more, and
Yeah.
we could have done this for another half hour. Now,
Yeah.
one of the things that really got me going on this one, though, was the killing at the funeral of the 12-year-old Mohammed. Just
Yeah.
because this was so casually written about all over the U.S. mainstream media. Like, it was just like there was classes at a funeral and somebody died. That seems like the kind of thing to be outraged about, and the kind of thing that you do a little bit more digging on. How did these
Right.
clashes start? Why were soldiers at a funeral? Why were
Right.
soldiers at the funeral of for a young boy they just killed? Why did the soldiers kill that young boy? Like, there's so much here that really deserves like more attention and some kind of at least emotion or outrage. And yeah, it's just reported on like, oh yeah, there's two elephants at the zoo and they moved one from the one cabin to the other, and then one like unfortunately died. You know why like
Yeah.
that? It's just kind of like, yeah, it happened. In fact, if it were animals, people would probably like have a little bit more emotion, as Goran Levy points out. So, anyways, I was all like worked up about it anyways. But then I read this article again. It's in Haaretz. The media yawns at Israeli army death squads, and he captures just so well of a lot of the issues I had. So I want to kind of just go through, Will, and point out I think some of his best quotes from here and break them down.
Sure.
So he says, these four examples point out that these are the soldiers choosing to kill. They kill because they can, and they're shooting because shooting is the preferred option. And I think he's absolutely right. In all these cases, they didn't have to kill somebody. It wasn't their life or somebody else's, and they chose to. Nobody is being held responsible. And again, there was a choice to be had of what, you could let him go. Maybe you could try a nonviolent or less, lethal intervention, take the guy down, arrest him. Yeah.
Right.
Well, in a way, I mean, if you're a 20-year-old man and a 40-year-old is running at you with an iron bar, like, it says something about your masculinity if you have to resort to your gun to deal with that person, right? I'm not
Right.
saying that everybody has to put their lives on the line all the time, and I get that it's different for the security forces and everything, but these are supposed to be like, the big bad IDF. Everybody remembers what's her name from NCIS could kick any man's ass, get the
Yeah.
get the knife out of his hand and then roundhouse him in the face and knock him out kind of situation. And yet these are apparently the forces that had to resort to their gun every time that there's a car within 50 feet of them, even if there's four children piled into it.
Right.
So that kind of did remind me, though, of something that is a part of the situation in Israel, and it's very ugly, but it's a part of it, in that the number and the amount of people in each population, Israel versus Palestine, because the world's constantly putting pressure on demand for elections and stuff like that. There's
Right.
kind of a demographics war, and so it's very interesting that the Israeli soldiers are killing when they don't have to, when lowering the Palestinian numbers is to their advantage. He says, points out that none of the soldiers' lives were in danger. All of this can be called, he says just blatantly, all this could be called terror. These are the actions of death squads. And if the soldiers would have shot a dog, that would have gotten more attention from the media. And I think, really who he's attacking in this article is somewhat the IDF by how he's describing their actions, just describing them. But he's really going after the media and saying, screw you people for covering this crap up. If you exposed it, if you reported on this like you reported on other things, people would care. But because you don't report on it, because you're just like, oh yeah, the little boy had a funeral, and the people who killed him showed up and killed some mourner, because you don't care, because you just kind of report it passingly like it doesn't even matter. And it's confusing as hell. I legitimately had to read the story from like 4 different sources before I could confirm to myself that must have been what happened, because it doesn't make any sense how you could report on that and not at least wonder what the IDF was doing at his funeral. And so anyways, because the media doesn't report on it, well, rather than there being appropriate outrage, the people demanding their representatives stop funding Israel to the tune of billions of dollars a year, we have the State Department approving a $3.4 billion weapons sale to Israel. And so this is just feeding the war machine that killed those kids and those innocent Palestinian people. We're going to give them $3.4 billion worth of weapons. These weapons will be 18 CH-53K heavy lift cargo helicopters. They're going to be used to help Israeli forces deploy more rapidly around their country, and so they could get bigger weaponry to wherever the Palestinians are protesting or stuff like that. They got this I don't know if you saw it, well, they have this little Jaguar robot, they call it, that's somewhat autonomous, that's patrolling the Palestinian border now. I'm sure they're gonna make some nice videos for the warlords of other countries to look at and be like, oh, I want to buy those things. But anyways, of the 3.4 billion, the Lockheed Martin's the biggest winner here, but General Electric also catches in big. 60 of their weapons are being sold here, and 36 of their navigation systems. There's also a bunch of 50 caliber machine guns and more weapons that aren't listed in this article, Will. Again, this is... It's unbelievable in a lot of ways, and really frustrating to talk about, Will. But at the same time, something has to be done in the U.S. because we are what is allowing Israel to do it to this extent, and at least to be able to do it and not receive like a pariah state nation type of, there are, I guess, some nations where horrific things happen and maybe it can't be prevented. Maybe the Israelis would just, kill every last Palestinian, but at the very least, it doesn't have to be done with the full U.S. taxpayer support and the full support of the U.S. government with a U.S. made army for them. It's disgusting. Anything you got on this before we move on?
Yeah, I was just gonna say. I mean, that's that's the way the incentives work. I mean, the Biden administration will continue selling weapons and doing everything that Tel Aviv wants. And if I don't know, so long as they do that, it seems like there's zero pressure on them to really change their ways. And I think Biden on the campaign trail had even mentioned something about, I don't know if he outright said he would condition, U.S. aid to Israel on them changing their behavior. I think he paid some lip service to that, but clearly that's all nonsense, and that's not happening.
Yeah, let's stay heated and talk about Yemen, Will.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, so take that wherever you want.
I really don't have any updates on Yemen, and that's part of the reason why I want to talk about it on today's show. So what's happening in Yemen is basically similar to what's been going on for a while, where a lot of the fighting has recently been happening in the Mareb region of that country. They call it Central Yemen for anybody who's, thinks Central Yemen maybe means right in the middle. It's not really. It's maybe, it's quite a bit closer to the Red Sea than in the middle of the country. But it is about north and south. It's in the middle. And that is an oil-rich area. A lot of the oil, flows through either, produced or through pipelines through there. And the Houthis have been threatening to take that city from the Yemeni government for a while. It's one of the key strongholds of the Yemeni government, and there's some fighting in and around there, but it doesn't seem like any side's gaining the upper hand. The reports of both sides killing civilians, either the Houthis with rocket fire, landmines, sniper fire, or the Saudis with airstrikes. Last week it looked like the Houthis were maybe taking a few districts, and the Saudis carried out a few dozen airstrikes in the city. And so that's still going on, fighting there. Then then there's, fighting occasionally reported around Hadeda and the city of Taiz, but both of those are still, in their somewhat contested states that they've been in for a while. And so for a large part, the battle lines in Yemen have looked the way they've looked for quite some time, with some fighting going on around Mareb. And so there hasn't been a ton to talk about other than just, children are starving to death. We can't get any reporting of how much is going on. The UN says 400,000 this year. But, we could just keep reporting that fact and figure it over again. But it's just depressing, and it's tough to talk about all the time. However, we have been in the Biden administration for 6 months now, and action isn't being taken. Even though Biden said he was ending offensive support for the war, it sure as hell seems like Saudi Arabia is still carrying out offensive war in Yemen. And so, no, not really, Mr. President. That hasn't happened. And part of the reason is there's been absolutely no pressure from Congress. This is one of the things that makes me absolutely despise the Democrats, is that when Trump is in office, oh boy, we could pass a War Powers Act that gets the president's desk and demand that he ends the war in Yemen. But when it's a Democratic president, where you could really put some pressure and you say, you will not veto this bill, Mr. President, and you could probably get the Republicans on board to override that veto, suddenly there's not a whole lot of interest in it. And Sarah Lazare has a great article where the activists are talking here, and, just citing the things that we've talked about for years on the show, how horrific the Saudi bombing campaign is, how horrific the U.S. support for it is that has continued to go on this whole time. They, make the point that we've made where, Trump in 2018 decided that he was going to end the mid-air refueling, but what do you know? The UAE got trained by the U.S. to do the mid-air refueling, so that's really not scaling back the war. And here Biden, says we're scaling back some of the war, but none of the crucial things that allow Saudi Arabia to carry out the blockade, to carry out their air war, we're still doing all that, providing the critical maintenance and everything. And so this was more just to bring it up, because it's been so long since we talked about it on the show, and say that something needs to be done. I love and I hate the hashtag Yemen can't wait, because there literally is right now some kid in Yemen who cannot wait. Where we're looking at, there's children starving to death in that country because of the U.S. bad Saudi war and blockade in that country. And if we don't do something soon, it's just going to be more and more and more and at a faster and faster rate. And also with other, things going on in the region like Ethiopia, where there's now a famine threatening 2 million people. If, you have famine in both of those places, it makes it just that much more difficult, because you have that much more demand on the aid, dollars available. I think right. Yemen only got half of the money the UN said they thought they would need this year. And that was only the commitments to what people pledged to give, not even, what they actually come through on. Historically, Saudi Arabia and the UAE is like, yeah, we'll give $1 billion. And then, a few $100 million get there, but it's pretty bad to walk back your aid promises. Anyways, yeah. Will, anything else on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, to our audience, I pride ourselves that we've done a lot of good Yemen coverage for years. The last few months, though, as you kind of been saying, there's not been that much news to report, unfortunately. A lot of it is just the same things ongoing. I mean, I think this Battle of Marib started in February, and so we're talking 6 months on now. There's just sort of been like a stalemate, it seems. They trade, the lines move a little bit here and there from week to week, but there's not a whole lot to really bring to the audience. But yeah, I definitely would like to try to do more there personally. I know I've kind of been slacking on Yemen myself, so I will try to do that.
Right. Well, you've definitely noticed a drop off in coverage and discussion about this since Biden's taken office. And now, he did come in and say that we're going to make changes to our policy, but that he hasn't followed through on that is almost worse. Right. That not that, Trump doesn't care that there's a humanitarian catastrophe in the country. That's the sign of a really, really terrible person. But the person who, says it's really bad and I'm going to do something about it, but only says that so he doesn't have to do anything about it. There's something worse about that. Anyways, Will, I think that's where we should wrap up the show for today. Tell people where they can find your work.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a staff writer at RT, and if people want to see what I'm writing, we've covered some of the stuff that I've written about here on this show. They can go check me out on Twitter at the Will Porter.
All right, and then you can find me on Twitter at Kyle Anzalone _. The show is at con _interest. We're on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble for video versions. We've added a few new subscribers this week to Rumble, which was really awesome. So we got first subscribers there. We're coming up on 100 subscribers on Odyssey, which is really exciting. It's an alternative platform, and we're doing really good work there. We're earning a bunch of Odyssey, the library credits through there. So if you want to support the show in a pretty easy way, sign up for Odyssey and then go subscribe to the show there, donate the library credits, help promote the show. You can, what haven't I done yet? Facebook and MeWe, we just have pages, conflict of interest, Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. The addresses are in the show notes page. Donate recurring fiat donations at Subscribestar and Patreon. I think that's about it. Everybody, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, everybody.